My story starts when my parents got divorced when I was about 7 years old. My dad got remarried, and I seriously struggled to accept my stepmom for who she was. My mom, on the other hand, had a couple of long-term boyfriends, but nothing that ever progressed into a marriage. My dad and stepmom had kids of their own that were beyond my biological sister and I, who didn't always have the most functional relationship growing up, mostly because of the divorce. What I'm trying to help you understand is to paint a picture of how chaotic my home life was growing up. Throughout all of that growing up, my grandmother from my dad's side of the family was the only constant that I really had. She'd also been a follower of Jesus for many years, which becomes an important point later. She was the first person to intentionally share Jesus with me that I can remember. I primarily lived with my mom throughout my broken childhood, all the way into my teenage years. Her approach to that pre-adolescent and adolescent stage of my life was to more or less treat me like an adult. This led me to have a lot of freedom to make my own choices, and ultimately those choices gave me the opportunity to become incredibly addicted to pornography as well as video games. These were coping mechanisms I had at the time that helped me kind of fill the void that my childhood created, which also created what I think is a state of undiagnosed manic depression. If you do see me looking down, by the way, I'm looking down at notes. I'm not scripting this. This is literally just bullet pointed, so wanted you to know. Ultimately, though, these coping mechanisms I just referenced were only making my problem worse, but they numbed the pain that I was experiencing, even if it was just temporary. Just before I turned 13, my mom started dating a guy named Joe. Joe was a believer in Jesus, just like my grandma, but he was the first guy who was consistently in my life that was bold in his faith and sharing it. During the time in my life where my addictions were crippling me the most, he invited me to go to a camp with him and the other people in our church. But there was one key thing about this that opened a door for God to speak into my life, and that was that I couldn't have any of my electronics when I go. I enjoyed spending time with the people in that church, as well as Joe, obviously, so I decided to go ahead and go, despite having to leave my addictions behind. It was there in the middle of nowhere that for the first time I clearly heard and received the gospel message. What this meant was that I needed to acknowledge that my poor behavior, the Bible would call sin, and that sinful behavior is preventing me from having a relationship with the loving God who created me. By accepting God's Son, Jesus, into my life as Savior, the gap between that loving God and myself would be bridged. When I came back from the camp, I sold all of my gaming consoles and electronics in general, and with the proceeds, bought a Bible, my very first one. I'm sad to say I don't still have that particular one, but it was the very first major step that I took towards following Christ. Many of you that are Christians watching this right now, because I'm sure there's several of you, probably noticed that I didn't accept him as Lord of my life, as well as Savior. This is because the church I was going to at the time was really big at promoting Jesus as a get out of hell free card. Without someone intentionally helping me understand how to study the Bible, it just kind of collected dust in between church services. Ultimately, after my mom and Joe broke up, I ended up going right back to those same cycles of addiction. However, the pornography addiction had escalated to having sex outside of marriage, as that addiction often does. I was jumping from relationship to relationship, desperately searching for someone or something that would fill the void in my heart. Throughout my years in high school, I was more or less your average teenager. For me, though, I spent all of my free time with whoever I was dating or playing video games at an excessive level. I ended up graduating high school with a 3.6 GPA, if I'm remembering correctly. Certainly not bad, but not as good as it should have been, considering how capable I am in the world of academia. If I hadn't spent all my time playing video games and going out on dates and, the things that I was referring to with that, I think I would have done a lot better. Just after I graduated high school, I got into a relationship with a young woman who had a son prior to us ever knowing each other. And because I lacked any deep accountability in my life, she and I moved in together and began a very dysfunctional relationship. We were that couple that we all kind of tease about that's on and off again when they're dating, right? They get into some small argument, they break up for like a week and they get back together. Yeah, that was us. She would ultimately end up leaving me permanently while I was at work. She took everything that she owned plus the things we shared, leaving me with just a few personal items. This left me in by far the deepest depression that I have ever experienced to this day. But it wasn't because of the breakup itself, because I didn't just lose her, I lost her son. who I had no legal right to, but I had basically stepped in as his father because his father was in prison. At this point, though, I was still not following Christ closely by any means. I'm still not allowing him to be that Lord of my life that I talked about a minute ago. During that same season, I was working a dead-end job, which definitely did not help the post-breakup depression. So I decided I would follow in my father and grandfather's footsteps and join the United States Marine Corps. My only spiritual voice of wisdom at this time in my life was my grandma, who I mentioned earlier. I remember her discouraging me from becoming a Marine because she felt that God had designed me to, as she put it, reach people with a message of hope. But I disregarded her advice, and thinking that I knew what I was talking about, I started going through the process to join the Marines. At that point, I needed to lose about 5 pounds in order to go to what's called MEPS and swear in to officially become, or start the process of becoming, I should say, a Marine. The day before I was supposed to go and do that, I was doing some training exercises with the other recruits. One of the exercises that I was doing with them involved a tractor tire, and during that exercise, I made a mistake and ended up with a distal fracture of my left arm in the humerus bone specifically, which resulted in 8 screws and a plate being in that arm, effectively disqualifying me not only from joining the Marine Corps, but any military branch at the time. This completely devastated me because it was the only path forward I could see that would put me on the right track. After that, I ended up selling cars for a couple of years and started making a 6-figure income. And for a while, just having the money to spend on whatever I wanted was sort of kind of filling the void, but not really. I also celebrated my 21st birthday in those years as well, and experienced a life that everyone around me told me was the best life you could experience. I drank way too much and ended up going home alone because I at least had the presence of mind to make my mom my designated driver. It always cracks me up even still thinking about it. I'm sure that looked hilarious. However, when I woke up the next morning, I realized it was time and I really needed to make that drastic change still, even if it wasn't as drastic as joining the military. So I decided to move to a different city. This would disconnect me from the connections to women who were comfortable with one-night stands, finding myself in search of a fresh start in life. I started to actively attend church for the first time since Joe and my mom had broken up. I got a basic job just waiting tables at an Olive Garden, but I was drowning in a car payment from a car that I bought while still making that 6-figure income, just barely surviving on that part-time job. I was then offered a job in Christian radio as a DJ for a small station the church that I was attending managed. I was told that I have the voice for radio and a face to go with it. No, I'm just kidding, but they did tell me that I would probably enjoy the job, but they did say also the voice was a real thing. I decided to take that job, and I'm really glad I did because ultimately it is what led me to fall in love with live broadcast. That love for live broadcast would eventually help me find Twitch and help me understand further my design and calling by God to reach gamers. I did my first live stream on Twitch on January 20th of 2018, just a little over 8 years ago, and I was playing PUBG with my closest friend from childhood. During that time, the car payment that I mentioned was still causing me a lot of stress every month. It was a little less with a full-time job now, but still a problem. I was living on roughly $40 to $50 a week for both gas and groceries. And, gas was cheaper then, but it wasn't cheap. I ended up getting into a small car accident with the car that I just mentioned. And to this day, I still don't know how I didn't see this lady coming. It's important to note that the speed of the impact in that accident should not have totaled out my car. The lady was driving from my passenger side over to my driver's side, and I ended up T-boning her. And I want to make sure I was clear. I was coming from a stop. So I was going no more than maybe 5 or 10 miles an hour. It's a little Chevy Sonic. Those things don't move that fast. But what was odd was, like I described, she went from my passenger side to my driver's side. My driver's side sway bar went through my engine block. The physics of that don't make any sense. Fortunately, no one was injured, and also fortunately, I had something called gap insurance, which took care of the remaining chunk of money that was on the loan after the insurance payout. For the first time in my life at this point, I didn't have a car payment and felt a sense of financial freedom. I was then more or less given a vehicle to drive by some people in the church, and it really helped me understand that first taste of community, one of the things that I talk about still a lot being a big deal to this day. Shortly after this time, I met another young lady. We decided to start going on dates just to see if we were even compatible as people. Kind of one of those situations where we thought we were each cute or whatever. But anybody in marriage or looking to get married knows you can't just think they're cute. There's a lot of cute people out there. That's not enough to sustain a marriage. And I was dating to marry at that time. I wasn't messing around anymore. About a month into getting to know each other through dates, I was doing an early morning job for the radio station, and we decided to go on an early morning date beforehand. She showed up in her pajamas to the date because it was like 4 a.m. if I remember correctly. And we went together. We met back at the church. She got out of the vehicle, and she was in her pajamas, and someone saw it and made some assumptions. Now, I didn't know anything about this until I got back from the job that day when my boss pulled me into his office and basically said, "You either need to get married or lose your job because of how this looks." He used the Bible verse that we need to avoid the appearance of evil as a tool to kind of support his argument. And despite me being willing and fully able to show him a receipt for when I got coffee that morning that had a timestamp on it, combined with the previous night's live stream VOD showing most of the rest of the time accounted for, he wouldn't accept no for an answer. In my naivety at the time, I saw this as a sign from God that I needed to marry this woman that I barely knew. So we got married within 4 months of even meeting each other. This was my first experience of deep hurt from people that would call themselves people of faith. Spoiler alert, that nearly pushed me completely away from Christianity later in my life. Over the course of that marriage, she would continue to consume pornography proudly and ultimately tell me that she wanted to be with someone else. We were in no way compatible with each other, with completely different outlooks on life. She wanted the American dream, and I've always been comfortable not having that. I'm also not at all an outdoorsy person, which I'm sure surprises many of you, but that's what she lived for. We tried to shake things up ultimately by trying to move to another state and got plugged into a local church that was very different from the one that we left behind. But unfortunately, we ended up getting a divorce, and I experienced that deep depression similar to what I felt when that gal with her son left, for the second time in my life. This is because I am well aware of what the Bible says about divorce, man. And I'd also swore to myself I would never get a divorce because of how much damage it did to me as a child. However, I know within myself that divorce was absolutely what needed to happen. God even confirmed that to me through the church that I started attending. Someone that I now call a dear friend, if you're watching, you know who you are, came up to me and told me that the decision I made that I'm fighting guilt for was God's will in the situation. Shortly after that divorce was finalized, I was at a bonfire at the pastor's house and I met someone. She told me that she had a son that she gave birth to when she was fairly young, so I knew that I had to be serious about a relationship before moving forward with her. I was also incredibly nervous about that scenario, which I'm sure doesn't surprise any of you given the fact that you just listened to the story of when that happened in a similar capacity in my life before. The difference here, though, is that there was a great amount of accountability around both of us that would prevent us from moving too quickly and, moving in before we're married or in other ways moving outside of biblical timelines. While the nerves were kind of increasing as we got closer and closer together, I received a confirmation over our relationship from someone who is still very close to me to this day. That confirmation was from brokenness. The idea was that from brokenness, God will make something new. Within a year of us starting to date, we were married. But I gotta tell you, this marriage is night and day different. Amazing what happens when you're not rushed into something by a church. Just before I got married to this gal who many of you know now, her name is Rachel, she and I decided that we would follow the Lord's design, if I get my words out right, for each of us in our lives. For her, that meant being a stay-at-home mom and a homemaker, and for me, that meant continuing to pursue reaching gamers all over the world with the hope of the gospel. So I started driving for rideshare platforms like Uber and Lyft to provide financially for my family, because ultimately it's very clear biblically that's my first calling, and everything was moving pretty smoothly. Our bills were paid, and on time, some of them even early, and I had the flexibility to pour more time into content when I thought I could. But then the vehicle I was driving to do that with threw a check engine light, and we decided to sell it because it was no longer safe for me to drive. Then with our remaining vehicle, I got into a car accident that totaled it. We're starting to see a pattern here. And our insurance determined the accident was shared fault. I'm going to be honest with you, that one I'm still a little bitter over. There's no reason it should have been shared fault. I'm not going to get into it, but I am pretty frustrated. However, I did learn the hard lesson of not having comprehensive and collision insurance coverages. If you don't have those coverages, you might want to get a hold of your insurance provider and find out about them. But I also found out that God can provide in ways that you can never imagine. Earlier that same year, we announced we were pregnant with our second child, and I had no car, which left us with no means of me earning a living or just, getting my wife to the hospital when she started to go into labor. Then a friend of ours offered for us to buy their old Buick LeSabre that was running. And yeah, I mean, it was running. It had heat too. And it was only like, they were selling it for like 25% of the market value. We bought that, and I decided to hit the throttle hard online just to see how it worked because our expenses were really low and I had the opportunity to take a risk. I also couldn't drive for any of those platforms I mentioned earlier because the vehicle we now had was too old for the platforms. And we were actually doing really well online, especially financially, because of some incredibly generous people from our relatively small community at the time. Then the apartment we lived in had a massive flood from a supply line bursting on Christmas Eve. Talk about unfortunate. That water problem was then so poorly managed by our property management company that mold grew in our apartment. So after a mold test showed 150% more mold spores inside air sample versus the outside air sample, they let us out of our lease without hesitation. The only problem with that was I had no provable income to sustain a new place to live. So we ended up ultimately moving in with my in-laws, and the plan was to live there for about a year. I kept creating content and chose to stay otherwise unemployed because I wanted to be there when my wife gave birth to our son, and a little bit of postpartum as well. This turned out to be a really good thing because my wife had a lot of postpartum complications and ended up in and out of the hospital several times. There were several moments throughout that pregnancy where we watched God show up. Biggest one by far is that our daughter actually made it to her birth. Towards the end of the pregnancy, we went in for a regular checkup. That doctor just noticed that something seemed a little off and encouraged us to go have our daughter that day. At delivery, we discovered that she had a knotted umbilical cord, and that if she had stayed in the womb much longer, she wouldn't have made it. God used the medical professionals we were already connected with to observe this and to advise us accordingly. To this day, every time I look at my daughter, I still see a miracle. God, still gets me kind of choked up thinking about it. But going back to it, right after she was born, content wasn't really progressing very much at this time. It was still just basically I was unknown. So in January of 2024, I took a job at a local bank as a teller and started rebuilding our financial picture to help us move out. I was promised a promotion within the first year given my previous experience in sales combined with my previous banking experience that I haven't mentioned. Throughout that year, we started putting things together to move out by the end of the year, getting a second car, starting to build up some money to buy furniture, that kind of stuff. We also found out we were pregnant with our third kiddo, who was due to be born by the end of the year. And then at work, I started getting all these really weird write-ups, none of which I'd ever heard of anybody ever getting written up for, particularly at that bank. And each of them were used as a justification to stop, slow, or completely altogether cancel the idea that I was going to get promoted. They were also really bad about honoring my schedule. I was starting to see the writing on the wall, and honestly, I needed more income than what I was making as a teller in order to provide for a family of 5 at that point. So I still don't know to this day what happened and why they decided I shouldn't be there anymore, which was clear. Either way, I was sick of working for other people, man. So we bought a second car, and I went back to driving rideshare again. And then, just a month after leaving the bank, I got into an accident where someone blew through a red light and totaled that second car we just bought. We were using both that car and our other car to travel anywhere, running an errand in any way with our entire family. Because we had 3 kids in car seats. You can't fit them all in the back row of a sedan. That just doesn't work. So not only did we no longer have a way to drive our whole family around except for borrowing a third row that I happened to have a connection to have, we were down to 1 car for me to work in as well and put all these miles on. Knowing that we needed a second vehicle to be able to get my whole family around, I started looking for a van that I could just pay for in cash. We did find one on Facebook Marketplace that got us around for a little while. It was rough. It was not running well, but it ran and it was safe enough for us to drive around town, so it was okay. But it would allow me to pay cash like I wanted to and then drive our other car for work. And then that other car, not the one we just bought, the one we had the whole time, started having more issues. And it only had 85,000 miles on it. It's ridiculous. With that car leaving me stranded a few times just running some errands, I realized I could no longer drive it for rideshare because eventually I'd end up getting stranded with a customer, and that's a problem. So I ended up deciding that I needed to get a new job even if it was just temporary, so I got a job at FedEx as a courier. That job provided us with the means to purchase a nicer van and eventually move out, which was a good thing. When we moved out, we actually didn't owe any money on the vehicle that was causing us problems. We didn't sell it, we just paid it off and held on to it as just a commuter for me to get to and from work at this point. After commuting for several months in that car that was previously giving me a ton of problems, it wasn't anymore, so I had started to consider becoming self-employed again. The local FedEx station I was working for was about to close down, and everybody could tell. So I left there once we got ourselves into a good, steady financial position, and then the car started having freaking problems again. You can't make this stuff up, man. We fixed it and ultimately decided to just sell the stupid thing to a dealership, opting to just operate one vehicle for a while, which gave us a healthy chunk to throw in our savings. This was a good thing. At the same time, my content online was starting to take off in a big way and still has some pretty good momentum to this day. And I was starting to make reasonable money. It was starting to kind of look like maybe full-time content was on the horizon, even if it was a year or two out still. Fast forward to literally right now. We are having another apartment leak issue and all kinds of other things that are reminiscent of our lives together. But through it all, I know that God's got us and he's going to take care of us because he's shown us time and time again. We've never gone hungry. We've never gone without shelter. We've always had more than what we need. I will continue to do everything I can to serve him and honor him with my life. That's all I can do for him, man, in return for everything he's done for me. I went from being a kid who was deeply depressed and desperately seeking attention to fill the void in my heart to a man who is deeply fulfilled and has a loving family that I come home to every single day. I will never try to indicate or tell you that following Jesus makes your life easy, because it definitely doesn't. Honestly, some of the most difficult seasons in my life were on the other side of deciding to follow him. The difference is that I have a source of true peace and fulfillment. By allowing the one who created me to lead my life, I'm on the best track towards fulfillment for my entirety of my life that I ever could be. My deepest and most heartfelt desire is that you would too choose to follow him and allow him to be the Lord of your life. Following him is not easy, but it is worth it. Just know that for anybody watching, my DMs are always open for genuine questions about my faith. I'm here for you, and I will make time.